Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Visiting Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Friday, following which the two sides inked 6 crucial pacts to boost trade and bilateral ties further. The two sides held extensive talks exploring ways to boost ties in several key areas, including trade and energy. India and Canada later inked 6 pacts, including one on energy cooperation. Ties between New Delhi and Ottawa have been frosty of late, as Canada was being seen as offering a platform to separatists demanding an independent Khalistan. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyse bilateral ties between India and Canada. Joining me on the programme today are Mohan Guruswamy, senior economist; Niraj Srivastava, former ambassador; Professor Pant, Head Strategic Studies, ORF; and Prasad, Associate Editor of the Tribune. Ambassador, I'd like to begin with you first. Of course, the Canadian Prime Minister has been in India for almost a week now. What do you make of his visit thus far?
Well, from the coverage in the Indian media, he appears to have attended a number of cultural programs, travelled to places like Amritsar, Mumbai, and he has been in Delhi only for a couple of days. So the coverage has been on Canada's link to separatists, Khalistani separatists. That has been the focus of the coverage of the Indian press. And that has some element of truth in it, but I hope it is not the whole story. You have just mentioned that 6 pacts were signed with Canada, including one on energy cooperation. So India's ties with Canada span a wide range of topics, of which one of the most crucial is terrorism, and it should be given very high priority. And I hope that Canada takes action to stop that, mischief in Canada itself. There are around 7 lakh Sikhs in Canada, who many Canadian politicians view as a vote bank, and they attend functions in which Bhindranwale and others are glorified. And they think that they will get their votes in the elections. That is not something new. It's been happening for quite some time. When I was posted in Ottawa, it used to happen, and we had cautioned Canadian officials not to do it, because it amounted to encouragement to terrorism.
Sure.
And it hurt bilateral ties.
I'm going to take off from what you have just said and go to Professor Pant. Professor Pant, is what the ambassador referring to a stumbling block between bilateral ties between India and Canada?
I think it is. And what has happened is, unfortunately, Mr. Modi's visit in 2015 was very important, because he was, there has been a significant amount of neglect in the two capitals. And it is not that there are no synergies, economic, energy, trade, education. There are enough aspects where the two countries can build. And I think Mr. Modi's visit had laid down a very expansive roadmap with then Prime Minister Stephen Harper. Unfortunately, now with this new government, which is sort of beholden to this idea of a certain kind of multiculturalism in Canada, and I think, as the ambassador pointed out, there are important elements in this government, including the Prime Minister, who have participated in at occasions in ceremonies that have been glorifying separatism from India's perspective, and I think that is very unfortunate. And that when it comes to Indian landscape, when he's visiting India, I think the messaging was not at all clear as to what he wanted out of this visit. Was it primarily aimed at domestic audience, or was it aimed at building bilateral relations with India? And I think that is the problem that we are witnessing in this visit in particular. And I don't want to say that the larger relationship is not going forward. I think it will go forward if the sort of agreements that we have signed materialize. But I think this impression that somehow this visit was not about India but about his domestic constituencies back home, that creates a problem.
Sure. Mr. Guruswamy, I'd like to bring you into the picture now. What were your highlights or your key takeaways of the joint statement today?
I think before that, what is interesting is that this Canadian Defence Minister, this Mr. Sajan, Harjit Sajan, he came here last year And last year also, the Punjab Chief Minister declined to meet him and said, called him a terrorist. He said, he's a Khalistani. And he said, I don't want to have anything to do with this man. And yet, the Canadian Prime Minister persisted in bringing him along and going to Punjab. And particularly when the Chief Minister had made a public statement. And he was there 6 months ago in some conclave, again saying, repeating, that there are 4 terrorists in the Canadian government. And, Khalistanis. He calls them terrorists and Khalistanis. So, in spite of that, why did Trudeau persist? Obviously, he is addressing his own constituency, and relations with India was secondary on this visit. And you could make out from the optics this constantly being seen in kurta pajama and garlands and all fine, 1 day, 2 days, but the entire trip with these guys in tow. The optics are bad. And the agreements are, agreements, governments enter into agreements for lots of things. Mercifully, we haven't entered into a strategic partnership. We've done it with 28 countries already. So, we didn't do that now. So, but, that I don't see much into that. I think in a visit like this, the optics are very important. The optics were bad from day one. And the sounds were bad. Now, Amrinder Singh then, received the man. He even shook hands with the Canadian Defence Minister. And, but that doesn't rectify the situation. But I don't expect the Prime Minister of India to be at the airport to receive every visiting dignitary. It's not been done for a long time. The official reception starts at the forecourt of the Rashtrapati Bhavan. And that, if it's an official visit, he's there.
And that's the standard protocol.
That's the standard protocol. He didn't go. So Indian media making much of it, saying he didn't go, he didn't go. Okay, he doesn't go. He goes unless they're good friends of his like Netanyahu or very important for India, like, he didn't even go for Xi Jinping. He received him at Sabarmati on the Bund for the first time. That's one thing that's important. And we missed something we missed by saying that contributed to the thing that the Prime Minister didn't go. And as if that was a deliberate snap, that is required. You can't go in England, they send a junior officer to receive you. Here we've made a practice of sending ministers. And I think the Canadian Prime Minister had a fairly good minister. I think Satyapal Singh was there, and
the Agriculture Minister.
Agriculture Minister. So that is okay. Because we have the important relationship with Canada is on agriculture. We import chickpeas and, lentils from Canada. And I think the biggest, what would be on top of the agenda of this visit was the import duty of 50% we've imposed on chickpeas and lentils. Because that is Canada's big export to India at the moment. And we have to protect our own farmers. So, I'm sure that was discussed. But I don't think there's anything else of substance to discuss with them. Okay,
let's move on now and talk about, some of the significant aspects of the meeting between the Canadian Prime Minister and the Indian Prime Minister today. KV Prasad, is the focus going forward going to be on trade and energy? Because both the Prime Ministers, in fact, stressed on that.
Well, I think if you look at the joint statement, it contains a very exhaustive list of things that both countries think they should be doing. And on their side also, there is a bilateral agreement, framework agreement on countering violence and terrorism, where interestingly both Babbar Khalsa and International Sikh Federation are named, along with many others that India has. And the joint statement also contains things on terrorism without any reference to Pakistan, but the fact remains that India's concerns does get reflected on the issue of terror. Energy, trade, agriculture, I think all these. But the biggest thing that the Canadians wanted all the time in pushing forward is the bilateral trade agreement or the bilateral investment promotion. And those are the two things which the Canadians, I think there is some kind of idea that we're going to take it forward too. So we'll have to look and see how you're going to push this thing, because the other day when the Canadians were briefing on the pre-visit, they were pretty clear that if these kind of agreements are in place, the investments would be at a faster clip. Because the Canadian funds which are coming to India, and the pension funds in particular, would look for some kind of a stable environment. So these are issues, and of course we have energy and trade are two issues. Right now I think it's like $8 billion, halfway equally, but there's a huge potential that the Canadians talk of.
Indeed, there is a huge potential. Ambassador, bilateral trade between the two countries has been very slow to kick off, to pick up. I think India accounts only for about 2% of Canada's global trade. What is the problem really, and why hasn't it picked up?
One reason is the sheer distance between the two countries and the the transportation costs, they amount to a significant percentage. But another is that Canada does the bulk of its trade with its neighbor, United States. Vast majority of things are done with that.
The distance doesn't seem to be a problem between India and US ties.
Yes, no. India and US ties are not a factor in India-Canada ties in the sense of political relationship. But I think the focus of Canadian business houses, the companies, is their southwards. Their gaze is southwards, to market southwards. And by concentrating all their energy on their neighbor, they lose sight of other opportunities which are there because the growth markets of the future are here, not in the United States, where a certain kind of saturation is taking place. So in the past, of course, there were also some other problems. There was a nuclear issue. Thankfully, it has been sorted out. There was an Air India crash investigation issue. That has also been sorted out. But this mental block is still there. And I hope that the Canadian businessmen and the Indian businessmen, they get over this, and we sign agreements to facilitate investment between the two sides, both from India to Canada. It's not a one-way thing. India is now a big investor in many foreign countries, including in the United States. So, and many Indian companies have bought Canadian, companies in Canada, the Birlas have bought, Tatas have bought others. So, I think there is a need for greater understanding between the two countries in all areas, including trade and commerce and investment, and a removal of some mental blocks, between the two sides.
Sure.
And greater trust between them.
Okay, greater trust is what you're emphasizing.
Trust is important.
Yes, that's what you're emphasizing on. Mr. Guruswamy, talking about trade, Canada is an open market. Free trade talks have been going on between India and Canada since 2010. Yet we've not seen any forward movement. What's the stumbling block really?
You see, like the ambassador said, the biggest trading partner for Canada is the United States. And United States, Canada is the United States' biggest exporting country. It is its biggest trading partner, not China. Most of the imports come from Canada, then Mexico, and then China. Okay, so, and Canada is a small country. It's a small economy relatively, it's a small population. That's why they have all these immigrants. A big land mass. Shouldn't be confused with the size of the country. And there's only so much trade we can do with Canada. We have a lot of trade with America, mostly IT, which is about $100 billion now, is because of these large markets in America. Canada is just not that kind of a market. And Canada is also just not that kind of an investor. And this whole business of, countries, governments signing protocols. You will invest in me and I'll invest in you. This is all outmoded in the real world. You think which private businessman is going to be moved by his government's desire to foster trade with Canada? You will do trade with Canada, the business is good. Canadians will come to India and invest. If the business is good here, money is good, they'll come. Don't the Americans invest in China, which country they see as a rival? The Japanese are the biggest investors in China.
But Indian private companies look to the government for some kind of direction when it comes to...
I don't think so. I don't think that those days have gone. I don't think... I've been on boards of several companies. Nobody looks at the government for directions on where to do business. You go to Africa, the market is good. You go to Egypt, the market... Many Indian companies are operating there. You go there, the opportunities are good. You don't wait for the government to send a signal.
Sure.
So that doesn't really matter. These are all things which the diplomats do, and they think they're moving the economy in different directions. Those things don't happen anymore.
Let's talk about the nuclear energy deal now, Professor. Deal was signed in 2015, as far as nuclear energy is concerned. How far has it come? Have you seen any kind of progress? Because, Canada was supposed to, take the deal forward, and there was a timeline as well as far as that deal is concerned.
Yes, I mean, that has also not moved forward in the sense that we had expected in 2015 or in 2013, I think. But I think, can I just also add something on the trade issue?
Sure, please.
We had a very interesting conversation yesterday. I was in conversation with the Canadian foreign minister, and she gave a short, we had a small event, and there is an interesting thing going on in Canadian foreign policy, and this whole idea of feminization of Canadian foreign policy. Now, and they are very gung-ho about it. They think that they are doing something revolutionary. It's a very radical idea. Now, what they are doing is, in their trade pacts with countries, they are putting in clauses about gender. So this, and she mentioned in particular, that, for example, we have done this with Chile, and she suggested, where there is an entire chapter on gender. Now, that's a very interesting fact, because then that means that for countries like India, who view this as non-tariff barrier, something which is going to accumulate even further. The fact that we have not had trade ties, substantive trade ties with Canada, will become even more difficult now that Canada is looking at the world through a prism which is oftentimes very difficult for us to understand, but from their perspective, it's something that they are doing because that brings in a certain Canadian flavor to global politics and global engagement. So I think that is again going to be a challenge as we move forward with Canada, their attempt to feminize international relations, which is a fine idea in and of itself, but I think in bilateral matters, it will create complications for a country like India, which is trying to move forward in terms of its trade arrangement. But I think on energy, I think the agreements that we have signed today perhaps point a marker now that, look, things have not moved as we had wanted, and therefore energy being at the core of Indo-Canadian relations should be given sufficient priority now, if at all we want to take this relationship forward.
KV Prasad, talking about energy, of course, as India continues to grow, our energy needs are only going to increase. Canada being one of the leaders as far as energy is concerned, how can both countries, benefit from this?
I think we already have on the nuclear and the uranium that Canada sells to India. But I don't know how much of the other sectors, that maybe renewables is one area where India needs to, because technology is something that Canada has, and probably that is one area where India is looking at renewables and non-conventional sources of energy. Because if you know, very recently we've had a pact with US where we are getting gas and oil all the way from United States, which is one way of probably trying to address the balance of trade issues that President Trump had been flagging. But that aside, I don't see, otherwise it's not a very cost-effective idea to get so much of energy all the way, as Ambassador Srivastava was also mentioning. The cost is something which you always need to factor, especially considering that India has huge energy requirements in terms of fossil fuels that we are buying. I think all these are factors, but non-conventional and renewable energies is one area where we should be looking at.
Indeed. Ambassador, to broaden the scope of the debate now, we saw the joint statement, Prime Minister Modi talking about how both the leaders spoke about various issues. One of them was, of course, terrorism, extremism, also spoke about Maldives. The Indo-Pacific and freedom of movement in the Indo-Pacific is going to be important, and both the leaders stressed on that. They also spoke about North Korea. So clearly, what's happening around the world is being watched very closely by both India and Canada. So is that an area of cooperation going forward?
Well, I am not sure if in actual practice on the ground, militaries of the two countries are going to get together and do things. Canada has a very small military in any case. It does not face any threat from anywhere. So these pronouncements should be seen as political pronouncements, diplomatic support to certain ideas, in which India and the West in general, led by the United States and also in some cases Japan, will actually participate on the ground, like the area of the quadrilateral, secure architecture of that, or what the Malabar exercises which the US does with India and other. So, but Canada is a member of NATO. Canada is a member of G7. So it is a member of all these OECD, all these clubs, and so it does not hurt to get statements of support from Canada for our political concerns. Such as Maldives, for example, it's very important for us, and the other countries in the region which are important for us. We live in a very difficult neighborhood compared to Canada, which probably lives in the safest neighborhood in the world, and yet feels a little insecure from time to time because of its big brother South, Now you know, so having lived there and here, if they can feel like this, they can appreciate how we would feel, flanked by two nuclear powered countries with a history of proliferation between them. So these statements are good for whatever they are worth. On the ground, however, of course, in the Second World War, the Indian soldiers fought alongside. But I don't hope, I hope there is no world war again where India they have to fight. But otherwise, I don't see any on the ground cooperation. My thing is that Canada needs to export more uranium to India. That is important. More technology. There should be more cooperation in nuclear technology and in other areas of energy. That is what is more important.
Sure. Professor, what are the other areas of cooperation really going forward between India and Canada? How do we take the relationship to the next level?
See, I think there is something to be said about this argument of the Indo-Pacific. In theory, I think both sides have similar interests. Both are major powers that believe in rules-based global order. And I think if you are looking at the changing geopolitical context in the Indo-Pacific from that context, you will reach similar conclusions. So I think there is certain amount of inevitability in the convergence. But I think that would depend on how ambitious Canada is about its outreach. I don't think they want to play a larger role in this part of the world to an extent that perhaps we would want them in terms of managing power transition in the region. But on the issues which matter to them in particular are largely still related to, in particular, this government, ruling party in Canada at this point, is very focused on multilateralism, so strengthening the UN and UN peacekeeping. And that is something that I've flagged with India, how India can work together, India and Canada can work together in terms of strengthening peacekeeping. Again, they have there's a sense of feminizing peacekeeping so that sexual abuse is reduced, etc. And India has sent an all-police force in Liberia, for example, which is a very important initiative that India has taken. So I think there is that convergence in terms of operations where we can work together. But I think one issue that I would flag in terms of taking forward is a number of youngsters are now going to Canada. There are problems, for example, in the Western world, in Britain and US, which used to be the frontline countries. And I think Canada is becoming a destination for our youngsters to go and study. Something that I think a Canadian government should be tapping more into, and I think we should be looking at those resources as our ambassadors who can cultivate greater goodwill and greater engagement, perhaps greater understanding between the two countries, which does not exist despite our being two democracies with which relatively similar view of the world.
Sure. Taking off from what the professor just said, Mr. Guruswamy, is Canada the new land of dreams? I asked that question because, in November 2017, Canada said it's going to take on 1 million more immigrants over the next 3 years. So is it going to be a hot destination for Indians and others to go to?
Hot destination for Indians who like the cold and certain kinds of Indians. Frankly speaking, there isn't that kind of opportunity for educated young Indians as the United States, California, West Coast has in Canada. Canada is a little more backwoodsy kind of country. So, farmers will go, people want to buy land and cultivate it and grow. I know a friend who runs an apple orchard in Canada. And, it's fine. That kind of investment will go, that kind of immigration will go. Cab drivers in Toronto and Ottawa and all Indians, lots of them. So, it represents an improvement in their station in life than now. But if you're talking about country of dreams in the IITs and in the Institute of Sciences, and no, it's still not there. I mean, these guys don't go to Germany because you can't compete with the US on that attraction. It's a different kind of Indians will want to go. We've got all kinds of people. So, we'll have lots of Indians going to do subsidy services in Canada and blue collar work and that kind of. It is not the frontier of technology. And that is a fact.
Sure. Okay. One quick closing comment now from KV Prasad, on the way forward for ties between India and Canada.
Well, I think just to take it forward, one of course is the number of students that has been mentioned has been going up, and probably one of the reasons is the increasing difficulty of people getting admitted into US, and post-Trump this is going to be an issue for most Indians, and of course the H1B issue is a separate on their side. That is one area where, and just to get you back to the defense, I think one of the entries in the joint statement today is exchange programs and also cold climate training. That's something Canada is a place where, because this is something which forms part of the Indian scheme in the larger thing. And remember, Defense Minister Sajjan from Canada is here on the second time. He was here last time and now he's back with, as a member of the delegation. They have had some defense talks, and of course this is one area which I thought needs to be looked at.
All right, with that we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Of course, the consensus is the relationship between India and Canada is cool at the moment, but there are several areas of convergence going forward, and it is up to the politicians really to see how to take the ties forward. With that, it's a wrap. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. That's it from me. See you again next time.